do. I'd like to call on the Prime Minister to open the case that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Hi, sorry, just wanted to check. Am I audible? Okay. Sorry, I'm just setting my timer. He's starting in 3, 2, 1. So I have two very simple arguments for today. So firstly, I'm going to talk to you how we think variable minimum wage better cater to different needs and circumstances of different groups in the population that we think like a uniform kind of minimum wage doesn't really address. And secondly, in terms of companies' incentive, why we think it will lead to like better worker outcomes and like better like business outcome as well. So firstly, the model. So we think under the kind of framework of variable minimum wage, we think it means things like taking into account of the kind of characteristic of like different workers. So for instance, if you are of a younger demographic, you're unskilled and things like that. So these all these factors will be taken into account to increase essentially your minimum wage. That being said, I don't think the realistic characterization of this motion is that if you're like super disadvantaged, the kind of wage gap between you and like average more privileged worker will be like drastically like kind of phenomenally high. We do think that there will be like a meaningful difference for this debate to take place, but we think that under this framework, we think this model is sufficient to address a lot of the discrepancies between what a lot of these groups need and the kind of disparity in the lacking disparity that a lot of the minimum wage fails to address. So firstly, I'm going to characterize to you what a lot of minimum wage workers that we are talking about. We think, of course, they come from a diverse background, but I think increasingly we see a lot of in these countries that tend to be made out of people who are of a younger population, for instance, from like kind of late teens onwards to like college educated and things like that. And secondly, they're more likely to be from people of color. They're also likely to be made out of like different, for instance, part-time jobs. They're likely to fall into the minimum wage category. When we talk about minimum wage, we also like to characterize the point that they're also likely to meet, address, kind of like fulfill certain essential job services, right? So things like food transportation, things like cleaning services, and all of these kind of jobs. We think these are the majority of the cases that we are talking about. So first argument, why do you think we better like cater to the needs and circumstances a lot of these groups? We think the problem with the idea of applying to like a uniform minimum wage is the fact that there are a lot of like disputes over like how much what is the kind of like minimum we have to set, and like the kind of the fact that like it's too much or it's too little, and all of this debates rest from the fact that a lot of these groups have very different needs, right? So for instance, if I'm a young person that like, for instance, either college uneducated, or even if I have a college degree, I'm unable to find some sort of like lucrative kind of like jobs. I have like a huge amount of college debt to pay off. We think by essentially setting like a variable minimum wage, you take those into account, right? The fact that, for instance, this person has a lot of debt, the fact that, for instance, these young populations are likely to live in certain areas with like higher rent. They're likely to need to pay off these certain expenses with their like living conditions. We think that you're more able to address those nuances, and we think a lot of you're more likely to, in terms of like economic sustainability, we think these people are more likely to lead a more like economically stable life, like in the long run. Also note the fact that we think a lot of these, accepted.
Okay, so the problem that this debate is this House supports. So you don't have any right to model in this debate. And it's basically about, how do you say, what is likely that governments will do when this policy is being implemented. So in that regard, please tell us what's likely that governments are going.
We think under the framework of this House support, I think we do have to debate on the ground that the government is incentivized to implement this model, right? Like for the kind of higher impacts of this motion to be debatable, I think we have to debate on that premise, right? So I think our model is quite fair in the sense that I think the logic behind variable minimum wage is the idea of like kind of addressing different disadvantages and different kind of like needs of different groups using like differential treatment and wages, right? We think that is the logic of this motion. So I think going back to my first point, we think you're more able to address that, and we think that is beneficial. And also recognize the fact that a lot of the kind of the system itself, by implementing like different minimum wage, we think it allows a lot of these people from disadvantaged background to, for instance, get off the welfare program in the long run, can get on their feet and be
DOI?
more economically sustainable. No, thank you. And second point, from companies' perspective. So I think a lot of the problem we face today is the fact that from an individual perspective, a lot of the minimum wage jobs are very precarious. The wage that are being given doesn't really correspond to their needs and living conditions. And from the company's perspective, we see this leads to a lot of instability and a lot of backlash in the form of worker strike or rally, and a lot of disputes, or basically very inefficient business operation, at a point at which a lot of people either opt out or they're met with a lot of negative backlash. So I think by setting essentially differential minimum wage, I think it allows for fairer treatment of the workers, because I think firstly it kind of reduce employer turnover, right? Because I think essentially when you for instance increase minimum wage of certain groups that, for instance, they're unskilled or they're focused on physical labor, it makes those jobs it makes working at minimum wage for these jobs more attractive, right? It means that, for instance, no thank you, it means that, for instance, it kind of forces companies to, for instance, raise a lot of these wages in order to tolerate the vacancies for these jobs, which are which in the majority of cases are essential. Before moving on, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so just to be clear, do you think that, for instance, the example you made about student debt, don't you think it's a problem to raise the minimum wage, because then they might be fired and then they have no wage to pay back their debt? Or would you make it lower, in which case they would earn less?
I think that's the problem, right? I think, for instance, for young unskilled worker, under the frame of variable minimum wage, that wage would be higher relative to other, for instance, other background, right? And recognize that minimum wage, the job said that, okay, but isn't just something disposable, right? They often work at very indispensable services, right? Transportation, cleaning, and whatnot, very essential for business operations, right? Which means that a lot of the times companies cannot tolerate large amount of vacancies for a lot of these jobs, right? So at the point at which you raise the wages for these jobs, it actually makes a lot of these jobs more attractive. And companies have to raise these wages. It kind of forces them, incentivizes them to do so, to make the jobs a lot more incentive, right? And recognize that a lot of people, for instance, who are more privileged are less likely to be working minimum wage anyway, right? So we think what this motion is addressing is a lot of people who, for instance, more likely to be unemployed and are more likely to be from disadvantaged background. With that, we're very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for their comments and call on the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Give me 1 second. Three, two, one. So we agree that some sectors in a perfect world require different minimum wage, different worker rights. But the problem is we're not debating in a perfect world, and especially because we're not debating in a policy motion setting, we're debating in a supports motion setting. There's a reason why the CA team chose this over the other type. The difference between this is that, you have to deal with the way that governments are likely to be able to implement this sort of policy and how is it likely to look like. And I'm going to explain to you why is it likely to look like on our server house. But this all includes in the debate government inefficiencies, lobbying power of the corporations, lobbying power of the union. We are going to claim that this creates inherent imbalance, privileging the most powerful workers and most powerful unions, and disprivileging the least powerful in our society. Let's give it a frame. Let's give a piece of framing. How is it likely to look like? We think it's most likely to look like based on sector. Right? There is no such thing as young workers union. Young people are not necessarily even active in politics in the first place, right? There is a thing such as union of the miners, union of the service workers, unions of the teachers, and all these things. And the policy, how is it being created? Because there is always a pushback between the corporations, governments, lobbying power from both, and unions, right? The way that is happening, the policy is happening in any place, is that some people are pushing the government to do a certain thing, to raise, lower, or do something like this in that sense. And the actors who are doing this are particular unions. And they're likely, if they're allowed to do so, to lobby for themselves rather than to lobby for overall, because that's something that is easier for them. Let's go into that now in the association. But let's first, one more piece of framing. This is not necessarily about Western liberal democracies, right? We have 6 billion people not living in Western liberal democracies who do not have these standards, who have a large amount of the political corruption within the unions, and all of these things, which can lead to a lot more inefficiencies, amplifying all of the impacts that I'm going to talk about now. The problem is the unions in this sort of situation, when they want to raise the minimum wage, if the minimum wage is static, they have to have a solidarity between all of the workers, either in a state, region, or, how do you say, a country in the association. This creates some sort of a union solidarity in a sense that teachers' unions are likely to co-opt all of the other people who do not necessarily have representation. McDonald's workers, Amazon workers, Uber workers, all of the workers who are not represented in the status quo are covered by somebody else having a lot of power, influence, and money, who has the incentives to lobby for them. But that's harder for them. And we admit that it's harder for miners' union, if they want to change the policy, to change it on a government level. The problem is, if it's easier for them, they might get what they want for their sector, and they might get a minimum wage increase for their sector as well, for the mining sector, energy sector, or something like this. But what is unlikely to happen is that all of the other people who are now carried with this worker rights momentum in the powerful unions that are carrying them, it's carried and they're left behind in a lower minimum wage with a higher percentage of corporations who have higher power to lobby against them, to push against them in this situation. Notice this, right? Is it harder for Amazon to convince that the minimum wage should drop down for all of the country, or is it easier for them to lobby the government and push the government to lower the minimum wage for their sector in particular? It's much easier for them to do so. And this creates the imbalance, because right now, Amazon is battling against all of the workers of the world uniting in this association, but under our side of the house, they're fighting against Amazon workers, which are much smaller constituency, with much smaller amount of funding, with much smaller amount of ability to fight the big guy in the association, which means that in the future and overall, you're creating this disparity. First of all, breaking the solidarity between the workers, but creating a huge disparity in inequality between these two types, which also translates into emphasizing, amplifying all of the pre-existing inequalities in society. So people who are already in a very good, powerful union, who have other benefits that union can secure to them, are now having more from this. And people who are not, from minority background, from disenfranchised background, are receiving not even a living wage, possibility of that way decreasing on our side of the house, while some other people are getting better. So miners might get something, but service workers might get nothing in the association, increasing the disparity. And we believe, even though it might be good for the first guys, we are going to claim that it might not be, the level of equality, that everybody is a bit above the swimming level and not drowning, is super important, because these people are the most disenfranchised. These people from these backgrounds who do not have a living wage, who do not have representation, are the ones who we must care about the most, because they're the ones who are dying. They're the ones who do not have healthcare. They're the ones who do not have, the ability to feed their families and to progress their communities in this association. But let's talk about the flip thing, right? That sometimes more power is not necessarily good, even for people who want to do good things. So this can fuck up important sectors. So unions have a specific, power, they have a specific interest in mind when they're lobbying for certain things. And it's usually with regards to membership of the union, people who are already in the workforce. They do not have necessarily obligation or incentive for new workers, for workers from a different sector or something. The problem is, if they have more power in some sectors to increase the minimum wage, some sectors just cannot bear this increase, which means less employment, which means less overall people in the state who would be on government welfare, who would have to fend for themselves. And that is the difference, because obviously there's a battle between corporations and unions, but this breaks this balance in some sectors and creates some sectors unpalatable, where jobs leave overseas, and leave some communities in ruins under their side of the house. I want the PI from closing if you have one. Opening?
Can you clarify what is your comparative, and how does it change on this side?
No, the comparative is like you have a general minimum wage for a country, state, region, like it's working in the status quo. The difference is the way that you get the differentiation and inequality. You get them on different sectors where the most powerful are reaping the benefits, sometimes not reaping the benefits, but like reaping the benefits themselves, but fucking over the other parts of the other things like teachers unions, police unions, and all of these other very powerful actors who have the ability, by the way, to strike, which country is dependent on, can fight for themselves much more under their side of the house if they want to increase the wages, minimum wage under their side of the house. The problem is, if you fund these public sector unions, which are also very powerful, you have less money for overall other things, for the projects, for giving it to welfare, for giving it to the communities and to community programs to help the most disenfranchised. Then the allocation of money that they want to solve is going into the wrong hands, even if they have the good intention. This debate is not necessarily about the good intentions. This debate is about what is realistically going to happen if you implement this. And like we sadly live in a world where this is going to happen. So creators some people might be better off, but that better off will be at the expense of the people who never had the levers of power to carry the momentum without this solidarity. That's why you should vote openly opposition. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for those comments, and now call on the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Government wants to be very clear in saying that the comparative that exists in this debate is weighing against helping these individuals and changing these variable wages, and then the possibility of unemployment that comes from like how companies respond to this. We think this is the comparative and the opposition case that should have been taken, and this is the comparative that I will be mainly engaging with, dealing with the POI that was addressed earlier. Before that, I'll be addressing the OO case that was actually brought up. So first of all, OO basically criticizes the model by saying that like this motion does not work like this in the real world because of lobbying, because of support. This is a supports motion and whatnot. So first that we say that a supports motion in like the debate meta world in the first place is a theoretical motion in which we support the creation of these variable wage laws and how they would work in their theoretical framework. Our model was consistent with the principles of minimum wage being a wage that leads to subsistence in life of like people so they can live their daily lives. Given this, people who are unskilled might require higher minimum wages in order to achieve the same standard that other people could achieve with lower minimum wages. So we think we were theoretically justified in our model. But moreover than that, I'm still going to engage with their arguments nevertheless. So first of all, they say things like, because of unions and whatnot, they're going to see an inequitable application of these wages because the people have power, because these people can push. First of all, we posit that like things like the teachers unions, things like the nurses union, these are not the people who are fighting for minimum wage laws because these are not minimum wage workers, right? With things like nurses, it's through seniority. With things like teachers, it's through seniorities. These are not the people who are arguing for things like minimum wage in the first place. And secondly, even if we were to buy their best case and say that like poor unskilled workers get screwed over because now their wages are even worse, we say that like strikes can still happen in that case, right? When the world sees that like they're like the government is providing this broad striking plan to make it even harder for minimum wage workers, which is like goes against the entire point of the minimum wage movement. There is likely to be large scale strike. There is likely to be large scale protests, especially considering that most people know what the purpose of a minimum wage is. Secondly, we think their world is largely uncomparative when they tell us about things like Amazon having corporate lobbying power. In their world where you have one blanket minimum wage, you're still just as likely to have like tech companies trying to lower that minimum wage so they don't have to pay their workers as well. We think it makes more sense to debate this world in a theoretical comparative that's consistent with the principles of minimum wage, especially in light of like this backlash that is likely to that's likely to occur. We think we're very theoretically justified in this, and we think it's uncomparative on their side of the house to say like union workers will push for certain things, especially when not everyone in the union necessarily needs the same minimum wage, and when we don't think union workers are these underprivileged people who should be the main stakeholders in this debate. But anyways, now that I've like dealt with the theoretical framework presented by opposition, I'm going to get into like the core of the case, which is essentially the idea of through like having this discrepancy between different groups and what their minimum wages are, people who you have to pay higher minimum wages to, namely unskilled workers, our young people, are less likely to be hired, creating unemployment and whatnot, dealing with this point. So firstly, we posit to you that the incentive mechanism to work minimum wages jobs changes on our side of the house. What do I mean by this? If you are a privileged individual and you know that you're going to be making less money out of minimum wage than you would have been making in the status quo, because minimum wage is favoring workers who are migrants, who are unskilled workers, people who are poor, you're less likely to try and go for minimum wage jobs. You're more likely to try and leverage to use your privilege in the first place to obtain higher wage jobs. Let me characterize this to you. If you are a very educated student, you are someone of a higher profession, you're probably not taking a minimum wage job because it's something you need to subsist your life. It's probably pocket change or something on the side. In comparison, a migrant worker who is working a minimum wage job is probably working 3 of them in order to like subsist themselves and try and lift themselves out of the cycle of poverty. We think that in the case that you're going to be making less as like a worker who is privileged, you're less likely to try and even aim for these minimum wage jobs in the first place because you know that they're not preference to you, because they know they're unfavorable to you. So on our side of the house, we say that these types of people are less likely to be occupying the position of minimum wage jobs and more likely to be setting themselves up, leveraging the privilege that they have in the status quo in order to reach these higher positions. But even if you don't buy that characterization, and let's say you think like, no, there will still be higher unemployment, why do we think we're still justified given like the weighing metrics of this case? We think that insofar as these privileged people, these people who are like going to be occupying these like jobs are no longer going to be like trying to aim for them, we think that if people who are unemployed are lower skilled workers, we think it's still better on the comparative that the lower skilled workers who are hired, because keep in mind, we don't think none of them will ever be hired. We think that like certain jobs, like, you know, working at McDonald's and whatnot, are jobs that exist in the status quo, that need to exist in the status quo, that have like a market demand that need to be filled. McDonald's just can't like slash their employment in half and then like have less business because they need these service workers to exist in the first place. We think that on the comparative, at least the workers who do get these jobs are able to subsist themselves in their life. This means that they're less dependent on things like the welfare system. This means that they're able to like lift themselves out of the cycle of poverty, and they won't remain in these like low standards of jobs for very long. I'll give you the comparative like of an immigrant worker, right? If an immigrant worker is now making more money off this minimum wage job, then they're more likely to put that money towards their education and then no longer need this minimum wage job in the first place. Then that vacancy is filled by someone else and the cycle continues, right? This is how it would work in an ideal society. We say in this case, yes, there is going to be a certain amount of unemployment that comes from people not wanting to hire these workers, but insofar as we think that the amount of workers who end up going to stay in these positions are not going to be occupied for the rest of their life, because we think that the main principal goal of this debate is to try and lift these people out of the cycle of poverty so they don't necessarily have to remain in these jobs in the first place. We compare this with the status quo comparative, where people are working a minimum wage job, they're never able to get off the minimum wage. The minimum wage has to be pushed really low, because if it is pushed higher, and keep in mind, people cannot make like have a decent quality of life with the minimum wage as it is in the current status quo. And if you were to raise the bar of the minimum wage in status quo, you would still get this unemployment on their side of the house as well. So on either side of the house, you need to raise the minimum wage if you want to argue for a minimum wage existing in order for these people to have a quality of life. The difference is on their side of the house, even if you raise the minimum wage, you get this unemployment, but you get people continuously trapped within the cycle of poverty. The comparative you get on our side of the house is you also get this unemployment, but now since we're allocating more resources towards the minimum wages of these people who we still think are going to be hired because there is a demand for these jobs, there is a necessity for these jobs, we think the fact that they will not be occupied forever because people are able to leverage this extra economic wealth that's being provided for them, they're able to leave these positions. And I've already given to you the comparative that we think that privileged people, so these are educated, not the types of people, it's already past 6 minutes, sorry. These types of people who are more privileged are not likely the people who are going to be going for these minimum wage jobs, especially now that they're less appetizing to them because of the fact they're not just pocket change, they're like bad money for them. They're making less minimum wage off these jobs. They're making like less than the status quo, right? Insofar as we think that these privileged people are likely to seek other jobs in the first place, we think in our best case scenario, these people aren't occupying these job positions because they know they're making less wage here, so they're going to be working elsewhere. And then the people who are applying for these type of jobs are people like the migrant workers, the types of people who need this. And in our worst case scenario, at least these people who do get these jobs are lifted out of the cycle of poverty rather than the comparative on-site opposition. What we need on-site opposition is a case where you don't have unemployment and these workers like are able to actually lift themselves out of the cycle of poverty. For these reasons, as long as we're able to prove the benefit of increasing lives for these workers, we are very proud to propose.
I thank the speakers for their comments and call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Can you hear me well? Okay, first of all, opening government should have read more of judges' briefings. There is a reason why the CA team didn't say this house would do something, but rather this house supports something. Because if it was this house would something, and OJ comes and says you're going to do it in perfectly mathematically efficient way, then there wouldn't be case for opposition in this debate. More efficiency beats less efficiency. This is why smart CA team said this house supports motion. So no, you cannot have any fucking piece of model in supports motion, as well as us or not cannot counterprop. If you could have counterprop, you would say you would abolish minimum wage and go full libertarian, but unfortunately rules of EP debating don't allow us to do these things. Please read judges' briefing if you disagree with me on this one. Next thing, about how minimum wage in these sectors doesn't exist. Yes, maybe in the US. In some other countries, things work quite differently. Just to give you a data, in Serbia, teachers make fixed income of 400 euros a month, net income, okay, after tax, 400 a month. Count how much yearly these things happen. Secondly, many of the unions that you mentioned, such as miners' unions, actually do have unions and actually do work on the minimum wage. Recognize this debate is not in the US, it's not in Western liberal democracies, it's just a small fraction of the planet Earth that we live in, and we wish that this debate was debated more, we wish that this debate is debated more in that regard. That all the benefits that are coming from OG are either it's going to be super efficient, or in general we're going to have raise. Look, if you have political capital to raise in general minimum wage, we're fine with it. Raise general minimum wage because we have approximately equal political capital. If you think this is good, just don't make it diversified on other. Just don't make it diversified on many other various things. But what we say is that usually things in budgets work in a zero sum way. Why? What does this mean? This means we believe it is more likely that some will rise and some will go down, and this will not be done in efficient way. Note panel. This debate comes down to us debating in what way is this policy likely to be implemented, and is that way beneficial or not. These are two of the most important things happening. Two of the most important things happening in this debate. I think that OG is pretty much out because their frame just doesn't fit what this debate, what this motion was supposed to be. Next, let's come to the basics of debating. How do governments make decisions? Okay, governments will make decisions how to cut it. Why does government in the European Union still has farm subsidies? Let's start from that. It has farm subsidies because, yes, even though farmers are like 2% of the population, if you have 2% of the population, they're going to vote for you on the elections, you're going likely to push toward policies to give them fucking farm subsidies and harm overall economy on the planet Earth. Because it is very good for you as a politician to get secure 1 million votes if you work in France. Very similarly, things work with labor unions. Okay, you're going to help those people from which you know that you're going to get votes to get re-elected. This is how we in general debate about incentives. Why is this so important? It is important because when government is making this decision, it won't make decisions altruistically, but it will rather make decisions to support those groups who are going to enable them more voters. Like in US, when police unions comes and supports Donald Trump, or teachers unions comes and supports Joseph Biden. So they're going to necessarily push for policies to help those people, not policies that are going to help overall USA or overall how things in the world are going to look like. This incentive structure is crucial for you buying us our argument that there will be reversed incentive on side government that is going to cause much worse outcomes than it would in general. This is a very important piece of framing. I beg you to understand what we are talking about. What is the next thing that Milos tells you that leaves completely unresponded? If those who have powerful unions are going to be the ones who are pushing, or those who in general can unionize, okay, McDonald's workers are not fucking unionized, okay? There's a very specific group of sectors in states that is unionized. Okay, so for instance, so what's going to happen? Those who are powerful unions are going to get even more power right now. Why is this problematic? Because inherently, if you already have organized labor union, and you have the collective bargaining agreement signed in the first place, this means that already, even with the same minimum wage, you're much better off with that sweet CBA signed, okay, than if you do not have CBA signed, which means that certain sectors who are really fucked up are now either going to remain the same while they will go up, or are in general going to go down, where miners' wages will work up, and miners are already those who are more protected in our society, creating more inequality. But secondly, to their framing, Milos tells you now all these labor unions on our side of the house, if increasing minimum wage is inherently good, have incentive to push on general state or federal increase of minimum wage in order to help people who are there, right? Nowadays, miners and teachers are pushing for federal raise, if OG is what they want. Now they don't want it. They don't give a fuck about cleaning lady who works at the hotel. Okay, they just care about their own membership, and this is crucial piece of framing that completely takes out the theme in opening government. Next thing that Milos tells you is how incentives also work in the labor. Before that, I want to take CG's extension if they would love to give it. No, they won't. Okay, then I'll continue. Secondly, how unions have reversed incentive. Okay, they only want to cater to people and take into account that they didn't give me extension. So they want to cater only to their current members. Okay, those people who already work, meaning they may cause market inefficiencies much more now than they would in the status quo when you open fucking Pandora's box so that every small subset of people is going to lobby. Secondly, we argue sometimes raising minimum wage is good, sometimes it's bad. Okay, this is not debate. This is not debate about this. For instance, if Amazon wants to raise federal minimum wage in order to fuck up competition such as Walmart, because Walmart cannot pay more than current minimum wage, so they want to take complete monopoly over market of distribution of retail goods, this is not good. And it is much easier for Amazon to lobby to US president, hey, we're just going to increase minimum wage in the sector of distribution and logistics, and not going to, then it will be to increase on federal level. Meaning that in general, we give much, much more power to people in our society who do not wish good for the society and who are going to fuck up the markets or fuck up the labor workers. But note, just to close up this debate and finish, even if you don't buy this, okay, this is all in Western liberal democracies. Now multiply all of our arguments. If we're talking about 6.5 billion people in the world, in corrupt countries run by dictatorships, where power groups work even in a bit worse way than work in Western liberal democracies, and how this is going to affect those countries and those workers without any representation. They say people are going to go to strike. Yes, miners and teachers may go to strike, but people who work at fucking McDonald's and cleaning ladies who emigrated for Nicaragua to work in California to clean people's houses are not going to go on a strike, because there will be others of millions super poor people who will be willing to do any job just to get some amount of minimum wage. If you want to help the poorest, you should oppose this motion.
Thank the speaker for their comments, and now call on the member of government. Hear, hear.
Great. Can everyone hear me fine? Brilliant. Sec. Okay, lovely. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 3, 2, 1. 1 sec. Yeah, okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, indeed, the motion does say that we support a variable minimum wage, which means that it can be modified either way, right? So critically, the motion is about giving flexibility to the state to adapt to the context and needs to vary this minimum wage either way, right? We agree with opening government that sometimes states may choose in specific contexts to increase the minimum wage, and we agree that maybe that increase may be beneficial for some classes in some instances. But what we'll talk about in closing government is about scenarios where the state will decide to lower the minimum wage for certain classes, which may indeed occur far more often than opening government scenarios, right? And additionally, what I want to point out is that we take opposition and opening opposition at their worst case scenario, right? Because their worst case scenario on OO seems to be states will use this to decrease the minimum wage. We'll explain on closing government how even if they do that, we tell you that how that's positive and often has substantial beneficial effects, because and its benefits justify this flexibility and giving states flexibility to lower minimum wage as well, because that's positive in many instances. So jumping straight into my 3 points of extension. First of all, on how minimum wage laws affect businesses and how states should be legitimate in reducing minimum wages when it's important for them in order to ensure that massive amounts of population don't go into unemployment. So if you have scenarios where in the status quo you have high minimum wages, right, and minimum wages are high, and you cannot sort of give workers lower than that, often that has 3 effects on businesses. First of all, it substantially constricts businesses because it's very costly to hire new workers, right? Which means, and because if they were to pay what the government is demanding, they cannot even break even because they cannot make up for the money they spend. That means a lot of times they take in less hires, right? And that means obviously you get a lot more unemployment within society and a lot less people actually being employed, right? We tell you that in those scenarios, it's extraordinarily useful for the state to have the flexibility of using variable minimum wage laws to lower the requirements of the minimum wage requirements for unskilled and young workers. Why? Why? Because now companies can then afford them. They can afford to hire them, right? And they can afford to give them jobs where otherwise they wouldn't have jobs at all. Now, opposition will say, but these are poorly paid jobs. Fair, but they are far better than the alternative scenario, which is unemployment, which is a scenario where companies cannot hire you whatsoever. Why is it better? Because unemployment comes with, because employment at any wage comes with multiplicative benefits for your future rather than unemployment, right? It comes with the ability to, at least minimally feed your family. It gives you future opportunities of being able to train a bit, not a lot, right, in order to get a better job later, rather than being unemployed, psychologically depressed, right, and with no opportunity for future growth whatsoever. So being employed is far better anyway than being unemployed, even if it's on a lower minimum wage. The state should have the ability to help businesses allow sort of greater employment. Second of all, on businesses, oftentimes high minimum wage laws lower the productive capacity of businesses altogether, because they can't hire as many people. Often they cannot produce. They cannot have the productive capacity to produce product and innovation, especially for SMEs, for example, for small and medium enterprises, right? This is particularly harmful. This harms the types of products which consumers have access to. But additionally, third of all, it harms prices a lot, right? Because if you have to give your employees a massive amount of sort of money, or maybe not that massive, but one which you can't afford as an SME, that means you have to charge higher prices for the whole market to make up for that. And that often locks out consumers and customers from products altogether, right? Comparatively, if we lower the minimum wage, right, and the states have that ability to lower it, right, that means these companies can take in more hires, which means they give salaries versus unemployment for those people, and charge lower prices as well, which unlocks sections of the consumer base which wouldn't have otherwise had access to these products, right? So essentially, what I'm trying to say, and the basis of this argument, is that the presence of jobs, even if unideal, has multiplicative positive effects on the lives of people which otherwise would be locked out of employment because of high sort of minimum wage laws, which via this motion the state has the flexibility to adapt. Milos and Janko, also say, but the real harm here is that this will be applied in an industry-specific way, right? And industries will lobby for minimum wage, lower minimum wages in their specific industries. I mean, fine, but I'm even going to posit that the industries they talk about, elementary industries, right, mining or whatever, should be helped so they can still function and keep offering those jobs, right? And they should be helped by lowering the minimum wage via these variable minimum wage laws, right, in order for them not to go bust. Even if it's unideal for the workers and they get a bit less as a minor, the alternative is altogether unemployment, and these industries would go bust because they wouldn't be able to pay that high minimum wage which was up until now. So we help them. Yeah. I'm happy to take Milos, Janko, engagement. You wanted it earlier. Okay, no. Yeah. Go. If you no, okay, fine. So second point we want to bring to the table. So critically, variable minimum wage, and the second extension. So a variable minimum wage law allows states to adapt to automation rates in ways they couldn't do otherwise, right? Critically, importantly, if minimum wages are kept high, when automation occurs as it is occurring now, it occurs extraordinarily rapidly and is accelerated by companies. Why? Because if minimum wage laws are high, then for a company, it's worth putting a bit more money, a more substantial initial investment now into automation, rather than paying a high minimum wage all the years in the future, right? What that means is that the state can use this variable minimum wage law to say, no, we realize that if we keep the minimum wage so high as it is now, this will put massive amounts of people quickly out of employment because of automation being accelerated by companies. So they lower the minimum wage, and then in that scenario, what that means is that it doesn't mean that automation will disappear altogether, right? We're not saying that, but it will definitely happen slower because there is no imperative for companies to automate now because they cannot support this high minimum wage. What that means is automation happens slower, there is time for adaptation for the worker on the market. There is time for retraining, time for moving into a different field, which there wouldn't be otherwise if automation were to proceed at these accelerated rates. States recognize that, and such a variable minimum wage laws allows them to lower the minimum wage in order to decrease the rate of automation when in scenarios where it accelerates massively, keep people into employment and allow them to adapt before automation kicks in. Third extension we bring to you. Notice that this motion allows states to vary these laws according to the economic context as well. Certain economic contexts, like economic crises, hit the young and the less skilled the most, right? They hit them because they have the less stability in employment and can be fired without seniority. By having the ability to reduce minimum wage laws, right, in scenarios where an economic crisis hits, you allow allow the young and the unemployed to survive, to keep floating, because businesses don't have to fire them, because they can still afford to pay them, rather than have to pay their the high minimum wage still, even in an economic crisis. Because of all these reasons, it's far better, even in an economic crisis, to keep these people employed rather than fire them because the minimum wage is kept far too high. Because of all these reasons, please propose rather.
I thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the member of opposition. Here.
Can you hear me? Perfect. All right, I just need to put out my notes. All right. 3, 2, 1. Panel, a world without a minimum wage is simply a world with a variable minimum wage at the level of the individual. They are abolishing the minimum wage by doing the same thing, but simply changing the individual to different groups of society. We think that takes away all the benefits that the minimum wage brings with it, namely those of different workers who are all demanding jobs, undercutting each other in prices. That is what will happen under their side of the house. That is why we have the minimum wage, and that is something that they will lose. First, a few points of responses to the other teams in this debate. First of all, opening government. I don't think they did that much. Most of my stuff will directly engage with that. I think there's one point that is important. They said these workers are essential and will be hired anyway, so therefore they can demand higher wages because ultimately the floors need to be cleaned. Note that that is complete nonsense. The empirical evidence why that's complete nonsense is that if that would be the case, that they are so essential, they would already have the bargaining power to negotiate higher wages than the minimum wage in the first place. And they would, right? But apparently they don't. What is the analytical evidence? They are essential, right? The floor being cleaned is essential, but they as individual workers are not essential because everyone can clean floors, right? Minimum wage jobs are generally low skill or no skill jobs, and there are many unemployed people that want these jobs, and therefore they are all competing. In other words, these companies can easily replace these workers by offering them other sort of wages. So it is not that they can simply negotiate for higher wages, because then these workers are simply going to be replaced. They don't hold as much bargaining power. That becomes important later on. Opening opposition. They talk about currently have privilege for more powerful minimum wage workers, right? That already sounds weird. And then that privilege gets shared among all minimum wage workers. 3 problems with this. The first one is that they say we unify all workers under our side of the house and that gives more power. However, they are also unifying all employers, right? So that power kind of balances out at the moment the voice against the minimum wage raise becomes sort of the same. That is probably something that happens equally. Opening opposition didn't resolve that issue. Second of all, we think most of these minimum wage groups all hold no power, because at the moment they would hold bargaining power, they wouldn't earn the minimum wage, right? The minimum wage are earned by people that have no bargaining power. I don't think there's that much power sharing going on. Third of all, we think those individual sector groups will never negotiate under no side of the house for a higher minimum wage, because all their power they will put into negotiations with their individual employer or their individual sector to raise the wages there, right? You can raise wages without raising the minimum wage, right? So why would they negotiate for a higher minimum wages? It's completely unclear. So ultimately, I think opening opposition doesn't prove anything, right? Sharing power between all groups of people that hold no power is no power for more for less disenfranchised people. Sorry, opening opposition, I don't think you have a lot of impact. Closing government. They say lowering the minimum wage can be good. First of all, I'm fine with having a debate about abolishing the minimum wage or something, but that is not this debate, right? I think in general also lowering the minimum wage is maybe in some cases good, but in the majority of cases it's not good. Why? Because most of these companies still benefit a whole lot from the companies that they have, right? They still need people to do the cleaning, to do other work, to work in the warehouses, all that kind of stuff. The minimum wage doesn't mean that their work isn't valuable and that they would be fired. It means that the individual laborer has no bargaining power against the company because there are many people competing for those jobs, right? And therefore they can set lower wages. It doesn't mean that the value of that work is actually really, really low. We think automation, etc., is very often not going to change on either side of the house, because the difference in automating or not is usually not $1 or $2 an hour. It is usually significantly more. There are also often very massive transition costs there that are not going to change on either side of the house. Very often there's a demand to work with people, for example, in restaurants, in hotels, all that kind of stuff. So I think ultimately at the end of the day, maybe for a few jobs, it might make a small difference, but they need to prove that it is for the majority of jobs that it is actually better to lower the wage, and otherwise they would get fired. They only showed it might be for a small subset of jobs. What we will show is that the harms, namely lower wages, apply to all jobs in the minimum wage category. Why does that happen? Because note that this breaks the benefit of the minimum wage. As I explained, a variable minimum wage is basically not different than not having a minimum wage. So why don't we want individual or group level wage negotiations? Because minimum wage always exists in a context where first of all, people are competing for a small number of jobs. And second of all, these people desperately need a job because they are poor and are willing to accept almost anything to work because they have nothing. The result is a massive race to the bottom, right? Everyone has an incentive to accept a lower wage because then at least they have a job. But therefore, other people are also lowering their wage level in order to get that job. And therefore, ultimately, the same amount of people get employed. It is just at a much lower wage level, and everyone in the group of minimum wage workers loses. The minimum wage breaks this collective action problem because you cannot undercut each other anymore. And therefore, everyone benefits as a worker group. What happens on government? This starts happening again because different groups have an incentive to lower their minimum wage because it makes them comparatively more attractive to other people in society. And as a result, other groups will also undercut and the whole level of the minimum wage will decrease. There won't be many more jobs because they're all competing for that same limited subset of jobs. The only thing is that all these wages are going to be lower. That doesn't matter if it's at the individual level, right, which is the world without minimum wage, or the group level, because that incentive is the same under both sides of the house, namely as a group to lower your minimum wage or for you as an individual. Why is that the most important impact in this debate? Because this applies to all minimum wage jobs, right? And that is very important because all these people are going to lose the money that they need so desperately. Closing government is like, a little bit more, a little bit less doesn't matter. It does matter a lot if they're living on $7 an hour, right? Then $1 less is a huge impact. You have to weigh that against, I guess, the only other credible impact, which is closing government saying some people might maybe lose their jobs. We think that happens at a very, very marginal level of jobs because usually these people still bring a lot of value to these companies. The reason they're replaced, as I said, is not that they don't bring value. It is that these companies have the bargaining power to ask for less. That is important. Extremely proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for their comments and now call on the government whip. Hear, hear.
Just to check I'm not being streamed.
Can everyone hear me? I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Closing government misunderstood this debate when they said this is about making the wage dynamic, because governments already do that all the time. In 2011, Italy lowered the minimum wage during a time of crisis, and the same happened in 2008. Don't let them get away that this debate is about dynamically or quickly changing the minimum wage when suitable to economic circumstances. It is, as David uniquely explained, about having different minimum wages between different groups. And that is the core of this debate. They've never explained why having difference between groups makes it eventually more dynamic, because governments, when the real need is there, and the arguments they mentioned, right, when it lowers prices and creates productive capacity, governments have a strong incentive to dynamically change this given the circumstances. It is about the groups that it applies to. And with regards to that, David brought the most important extension in this debate. We're going to first summarize that, then deal with CG, and then clean up the mess of the opening half. What did David explain? Very simple. There is an incentive to lower your own minimum wage to steal the jobs of others. Because if you're a white Rust Belt worker and you see that migrants are taking your job, lowering the minimum wage and accepting that lower wage will eventually make you better off, because you will then get hired for the reason that closing government said it's better to have no job than no job at all. That leads to an overall minimum wage, because the migrants then, or the union then, responds by saying, we then also need to lower our minimum wage to be competitive against the white Rust Belt worker. And here's where Srishti fundamentally misunderstood our extension. She said, oh, the old person cannot undercut the wage of a younger person. They do so by lowering their own wage first. It is not that the old person says, young person, you need to earn a lower wage. They can lower their own to make sure that they get the job of a younger person. For that specific reason, they can undercut them. Why is this the most important thing in the debate, and why is it better than the version that opening opposition brought you? Opening opposition goes from a very particular, extreme circumstance, right? This is one powerful union that can fight against the government, despite the fact that in most Western liberal democracies, this is heavily regulated, and in most functioning democracies, instead of the oligarchy of the United States, this is done relatively well. David explains why in even the best circumstances possible, when everyone has good intentions, it's the rational self-interest of a particular group to undercut their own wage. Hence why it applies to all circumstances. It is much more generalizable than the specific examples that the opening opposition brought to you in this debate. And that impact that David brought to you of you lower the minimum wage now for everyone is also the most impactful in this debate, because the couple of dollars that someone who's currently on $15 as an Amazon worker now no longer earns per hour make the difference between making rent and going bust. And that is the difference that we create, because on our side of the house, and this is the comparative that they miss, you solve the collection after problem. The old person or the white Rust Belt worker has no incentive to undercut their own wage for young people, because it doesn't affect their own wage. Everyone has the same minimum standard. Hence why that definitively won the debate. Now, closing government doesn't seem to believe that this is the case. They think this debate about a couple things that it really is not about. The first thing they say, it's about lowering wages. That's good for the economy. Despite the fact that the opening government explicitly in a POI said, we want to increase wages for vulnerable groups. So it's an explicit stat. I think that this debate is simply not about that, because if it's so good, they can do that. So all of Tudor's arguments about productive capacity, if that's so good for the economy, they can lower the wage. Then they say, no, it's about specific industries. We can save the car industry that otherwise will go bust. There are two problems here. One, if your industry only exists because it pays workers absolute scrap, and that is the only reason why it's profitable, they should frankly go bust, because it's not a competitive industry, and you simply lock workers in an industry that is likely to die out anyway. We think that the better solution is let that industry go bust, re-educate workers, move them to an industry in which they can earn a minimum wage and have profitable companies at the same time. Hence why this is not about specific industries going bust. Also, if you really think it is about that, you have other economic policies. You can have bailout packages, massive amounts of subsidies. So this is not an exclusive benefit. And the same is true for the ridiculous point about automation. The incentives exist anyway. Amazon, the reason why they automate so much is because the costs are exponentially so much lower. When you let a robot do it, then it's not going to matter in that case. The time scale, literally, it's about maybe a couple of months of the robot being there earlier. So no. And then they come up with an even funnier example, which is, the young and the unemployed. We need to save them in a time of crisis. As I mentioned in my introduction, in the extreme cases that they talk about, this debate literally does not apply, because governments have flexibility in doing that. It's what we've seen in history across the world, in the US in 2008. Hence why this debate is not about that. And the final thing, they give a lot of analysis. It's better to have a job. Duh. Nobody disagrees with this. The thing people disagree about is, will they lose their job? We don't think they will. And the analysis that David gave that nobody responded to is, these workers are crucial but replaceable. Hence why it's not like you will not hire people and I'm not going to serve your coffee. the, oh, I'm not going to let the supermarket work. It is simply that you hire someone else. Here's when I want to add something. They make the most underprivileged workers worse off. Why? If it is true that you increase the minimum wage, for instance, for migrants or people of color, then those people who are already disprivileged become more expensive to Amazon and to other employers. Hence why they will pick the already privileged, cheaper white worker now over the disprivileged worker. So the only thing they do is a shift in employment to the already privileged. Hence why I think they're very, very clearly out of this debate. So that's what CG. Frankly, it's about differences between groups. Okay. Final little bit of thing that I'm cleaning up that I want to do with regards to opening opposition. I think open decision has a very interesting case about the incentives of workers, and I'll explain why it's very relevant. Before that, Tudor, go ahead, PY.
So the motion doesn't say that individual people can select what kind of minimum wage they have. So your whole extension isn't applicable on the motion. Our flexibility is on different groups which need help.
Tudor, it's clear. We are not saying that as a group you can do that together. It is not white Rust Belt workers picks, like puts up in hand like I want a lower wage. It is the union of car manufacturers, for instance, lowers it altogether because all of the individual people have an incentive to do so. That was clear from the start, wasted POI. So why were you betting on the opening opposition? I think this is fairly clear. All of the examples that they mentioned of heavily corrupt countries or irregularly powerful companies, and then they will misuse this policy, already happen. Amazon can do that for giving lower benefits, for instance, or Amazon can do this in general through lobbying. And so the difference is relatively marginal. And indeed, like all that, like corruption regimes and something, I don't think anything changes there. David wins in this debate by saying, even with the best of intentions, this is still going to happen, and it's still going to lower the wages of workers. And this also, by the way, extremely clearly beats the opening government, because the opening government is simply saying, well, it is good for a student with debt if they earn more. David explains why the student with debt now has an incentive to accept a lower wage versus a migrant or an older person, because then they will have a job in the first place, exactly for the reason that the closing government mentioned. Hence why we've clearly won this debate.
I thank the speaker for their comments, and thank you everyone for an enjoyable debate. If you want to just leave the breakout room, and we will call you back when we have a call. Thanks, guys.